Okay. Qualified disability trust. So let's talk about them now, because that is important. Now, before lunch, I talked about how trusts, even trusts set up in a will, are now going to be taxed at the top rate of 44% on income generated within the trust. So let's say the trust has some investments and it earns some income, interest income, because it has some term deposits with the bank. It's going to pay tax on that income if the trustee decides to have that income retained in the trust for use in a later year. Qualified disability trusts are going to be exempt from that top rate of tax rule. So the qualified disability trust will be able to pay tax as if it was a separate taxpayer, paying a low rate on the first $30,000 of income, 20% or so. So this means that if, again, any income that's left in the trust is going to be taxed at that low rate and can be used for later on down the road, because perhaps you don't want to give it to the beneficiary this year because it would interfere with government assistance. Mm-hmm. So you save that money for later. Now, how do you set up a qualified disability trust?
So the trust has to be resident in Canada. It has to be a testamentary trust, that it's got to be set up in a will as opposed to a living trust, which we talked about. And again, we can flip back to those slides, or you can flip back to them later. But a living trust is just set up when the settlor or the trust maker is still alive. Testamentary trust set up in the will. So a qualified disability trust must be from a will. No contributions from living persons at all. So again, just testamentary. And then the qualifying beneficiary has to elect in their own tax return every year. And they need to qualify for the disability tax credit, which we're going to talk about in the next slide.
Okay. So just on elaborations of that, it could be that somebody says, oh, qualifying disability trust, when the parent died, they set up this trust, and this is great. It has income that's earned for the benefit of little Johnny who's disabled, and that's a really great idea. I think I'll put in some money too, but I'm still alive, and that's a no-no, because if I put money into the qualified disability trust, it's not a testamentary trust anymore because it received money from somebody who was alive. So that would completely... So even though the urge is, oh, I want to help, you can't. It's only the stuff that goes in on the death that...
You can help, just not by putting money into the trust.
Yeah, you can help, but you can't put money into the trust.
This is not a way to help.
Now, you can use... we like to say will trust because it's shorter than testamentary trust. But if you've got a life insurance policy and there's a death benefit that's paid out on death, well, somebody has to die before the death benefit is paid out. So that could also, you could also set up a qualified disability trust with insurance benefits. If you say, okay, I've got this trust, these provisions, and the money going into the trust will be the death benefit. When I die, my life insurance pays out. The life insurance will go to Laley as trustee of this trust. That will qualify because I have to die before the money comes in. If you're doing that, and I've seen this sometimes, people say, well, let's set up a trust. In order to have a trust, we have to have some property in the trust. So they have somebody kick in $100 to start off the trust. Now the trust is not a testamentary trust anymore because it received $100 from somebody who was alive. So you have, what you do is you have the trust terms, but the trust doesn't come into effect until the insurance money comes in. So you just have a document that you file that these are the terms of the trust, but the trust doesn't start until the insurance money pays out because it has to be on somebody's death. Okay, we'll say will trust just because that's a shorter term, but it could also be with insurance. So, who can the beneficiary be? One of the beneficiaries must qualify for the federal disability tax credit. Now, you can have other beneficiaries who do not qualify for the disability tax credit. That's okay. That doesn't disqualify the trust. But at least one beneficiary has to qualify for the disability tax credit. The beneficiary has to be named specifically in the will. So I have to say, this is a trust for Johnny, who qualifies for the disability tax credit. So I have to name Johnny specifically. Now, if you set up the trust and you say the children of Johnny, and one of Johnny's children happens to qualify for the disability tax credit, that won't work. You have to name the specific individual. I think what the government was doing is doesn't want people to say, you know, we'll set up this trust just in case somebody becomes disabled down the road. So it has to be somebody. So what that means is that you're going to name all of the existing children and grandchildren if you're setting one of these things up, just in case, I suppose. But you have to name them. And you can elect on only one qualifying disability trust per year. And effectively, you've only got one of these per disabled person. Mm-hmm. So if, say if Dad sets up a qualified disability trust and it qualifies, and then say Dad's sister, who would be the aunt, I guess, mm-hmm. The aunt says, well, I want to set one of these up too. She sets up a separate one. That won't qualify because...
Well, it depends on what the beneficiary elects. The beneficiary gets to pick, but only can pick one.
Beneficiary can only pick one. So let's say that the aunt's is smaller.
Yeah, then pick Dad's.
You pick Dad's.
Yeah.
So what the aunt has to do then is say, okay, there's an existing qualified disability trust, so when I die, I will kick in more money to that qualified disability trust because I have to die first, and that's money going in on somebody's death. So there has to be some coordination among family members in that case. Mm-hmm. So one qualified disability trust for any one disability tax credit individual. You can have other beneficiaries who are not disabled. That won't, you know, but one trust per disabled beneficiary. Mm-hmm. That make sense?
Kind of.
Okay.
Okay, great. So eligibility for the disability. Sorry, go ahead.
Clarify. So if grandfather dies
mm-hmm.
and leaves money into a QDT,
right,
and then aunt dies, aunt can leave money into the same QDT.
She would say.
So a whole bunch of people can say, oh, there's that QDT that's now been set up, and we're all leaving money there.
They can, as long as they die first.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it would be in their will. Yeah, in their will. They can name that trust in their will, and then funds can go into it because it's not a contribution from a living person.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Eligibility for the disability tax credit. Any of these four things. So either you are blind, you are receiving life-sustaining therapy, or you're markedly restricted in one basic activity of daily living, or significantly restricted in two basic activities of daily living. It's actually fairly simple, but the basic activities are, this is where things are, it's a little bit frustrating actually, I think. Feeding is just actually the act of putting food in your mouth. It doesn't include the ability, for example, to get your groceries, to prepare a meal, to all of the things that are sort of surrounding feeding. It's actually just the specific act of feeding. So there's little complexities that can come in there, but that's the basic requirement.
And I'm assuming everybody's familiar with the disability tax credit because you've probably been through that procedure, having a doctor fill in the form saying that the person qualifies. Now, the trouble with the rules is that the beneficiary has to file the selection under the new rules after 2016 for for the will trust to qualify as a qualifying disability trust. So if the electing beneficiary lacks capacity and they're a minor, the legal guardian can elect on their behalf. If they're over the age of majority, then their representative can elect on their behalf, or a court-appointed representative. So you do have to have a mechanism for that person to be able to make that election. So it's important to have the representation agreement in place, the power of attorney in place, or the committee in place. And if there is a question of mental impairment, you want to get that in place as soon as the person can sign it, just in case there's a deterioration later on. Because if you have it in place, then you've got it. And you've got somebody who can make that election. And of course, you want alternates appointed just in case something happens to the person who's named as the representative. They can't continue, they move out of the country, they're killed. You want to have an alternate, at least one alternate, and a mechanism for somebody to appoint a successor, so that there's always somebody who can act. Now, the question was, if you have non-disabled beneficiaries, that doesn't mean that the trust is disqualified, but if you pay any money out to the non-disabled beneficiaries, the benefit from the graduated rate gets clawed back. So you have to go through a fairly complicated computation of, well, if I had on this, so let's say we have $100 of income, we pay 15% tax on that, and we've got $85 left. And then they take the $85 and, let's say my disabled beneficiary died, so I got $85 left. I then give it to the other beneficiaries. Now I've got to say, oh, well, if I paid the top rate of tax on that $100, I would have paid $44 rather than $15. So now I've got to pay 44 minus 15. That difference, I've got to pay that to the government. So now I only pay the $56 out to the non-disabled beneficiary. Now there's no interest component because it's just that the money isn't used for the person with the disability. So now the government says, we gave you that concession to help out. That money isn't being used for that person, so now we want the rest of the tax. Generally, the short answer to the question is, yes, all of that income is going to be used for the benefit of the disabled beneficiary if you want to get the graduated rates, but you have the option of paying the clawback, having it taxed at the top rate, and paying it out to the other beneficiaries. And of course, like any trust, if you pay out income to the non-disabled beneficiaries, that's it'll be just taxed at their rate anyway. You always have that option. But I'm assuming here the main objective is to build up a fund for the benefit of the disabled beneficiary for later on. So you're amassing that and
not to be having to make payments all the time that might compromise the disability benefits that person is receiving from the government, right? So that's part of why you want to leave the money in the trust, let it grow at these graduated rates. So that's why this is a useful trust.
Okay. The other thing to say is the trust has to be resident in Canada. So your trustee has to be resident in Canada if the trustee is making the decisions. So let's say you appoint somebody as trustee and they move out of the country, they've got to resign as trustee and appoint some other Canadian as trustee before they move, because you want the trust to remain a Canadian trust. And it makes sense. If the trustee is in Australia, how is the CRA going to supervise that trustee in Australia? Well, they could get the Australians to do it, but the rules are for trusts that are in Canada, subject to audit by the CRA, that the CRA can easily supervise.
So that means trustees must be resident in Canada.
Qdt Problems Scenario One. Ben a disabled person qualifies for the disability tax credit, has 4 grandparents. Each grandparent sets up a testamentary trust, naming Ben specifically as a beneficiary. Each trust generates $20,000 of income. Ben can elect only one trust as a QDT. So only $20,000 is taxed at the graduated rates. The other $60,000 is taxed at the highest rate. So again, one QDT per disabled individual. And in that case, that's a case where the other 3 get, the grandparent who dies first sets up the QDT, and the other 3 grandparents then say, okay, we're going to give something on our death to that QDT.
And they say it in the will.
And they say it in the will, or the insurance designation, because it's got to be something that goes in on the death of somebody.
So practically speaking, you don't know who's going to die first. How do they actually set it?
Well, you have to amend you don't know who's going to die first. So how do you do that? Well, each person sets up a QDT, but then you say, if there's already a QDT existing, then it goes into, and in effect, once the first person dies, you revise the other 3 wills. Although, sometimes people don't remember to review their wills, so you try to
The first
take care
option
of
is
it.
a better
The
option.
first option is a better option,
Yeah.
but after the death, you would then amend the other 3 wills is even better.
Yes.
I have a question about, let's say you have 3 different people who want to set up a QDT. They might each have their own trustee that they choose. What happens if I want to leave money to my son in a QDT? His grandmother on the other side sets up a QDT naming someone as a trustee that I'm not comfortable with.
Yeah.
Then I lose the ability, I guess. I can either choose to contribute to that QDT with a trustee that I'm not comfortable with, or I just lose my ability to create one.
Yeah, the question is...
Well, you'll still have your ability to create one. It's just that then the child has to pick.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the question is if 2 people set up QDTs with different trustees, then yes, the child has to choose, and you would choose the one with the higher income level. But I think so as to avoid that situation, the best thing is to try to talk with the person. There's a lot of communication among family members here. If people want to help, then you need to say, okay, well, let's talk about this, and we need to settle on a trustee that we're both comfortable with so that we do the best for that person. And these rules are going to require a lot of communication among family members because you've got to do some coordination now. Yeah. Do you want to do scenario 2?
Yeah, for sure. So in scenario 2, parent sets up a testamentary trust in their will for their disabled child, Beth. The parents also make Beth a beneficiary of a life insurance policy via an insurance trust, which is a kind of living trust, but it doesn't kick in until death. The money doesn't go in until...
Yeah, so nothing goes, it's set up, you set the trust terms up during your lifetime, but remember, no money goes in until the death and the insurance benefit comes out.
So then this is, again, that's problem that we just alluded to there, that either the testamentary trust or the life insurance trust can be a QDT, but not both, so the beneficiary must choose. So the solution here is to have the insurance proceeds paid to the estate rather than the trust, and then there's just the one estate, right? So those insurance proceeds go into the estate, and there's the testamentary trust set up in the estate, and then you've kind of solved it.
Yeah.
All the money is in one
place.
pot.
So coordination required.